Welcome to the Minelab Expert Series. Dive into the world of metal detecting with us as we tackle both its basics and intricacies, all while posing tough questions to the Minelab engineers themselves. Join us in this thrilling quest beneath the surface of metal detecting. Right, hello, welcome back everybody. Today we're going to talk about discrimination. Because I'm a Vanquish user, that's been my first detector. I've seen on the Vanquish the discrimination segments, and kind of building on what we did or what we spoke about in the last episode, with the kind of unpredictability of the ground and where targets can lie. I kind of wonder why we need discrimination and basically how it works as well. So how and why do we need discrimination?
So discrimination it fundamentally builds on what we were talking about in the last video with target IDs. First trick is to derive a target ID from the target you're interested in, and then from that we can build up discrimination. Discrimination's a fancy word for making a decision. With that target ID, the detector needs to tell you whether to dig the target or not, or can tell you whether to dig the target or not. And so for that we use discrimination. So one of the first things you really need to do with discrimination is you want to know whether the target is ferrous or non-ferrous. And in a Minelab detector, ferrous targets will generally be negative, and non-ferrous targets will generally have positive IDs. This is a little bit different in the CTX 3030 that Paul was talking about in the past, but on a multi-IQ based detector on your Vanquish, for example, it's looking at those target IDs from the negative range into the positive range. And so you can make the decision as to whether it's ferrous or non-ferrous, and then you can decide to dig based on that. Or you can actually start to make more complex patterns, where you can tell the detector that I don't want to dig anything down at 0 and 1 because that's where my coke's going to be. And so the detector will then ignore those and not play a target signal. But I do want to see the higher target IDs. And so you can start to set up relatively complex patterns, particularly if you're in an environment where you know what sort of targets you're going to see. You can actually set up a pattern that shows that. Mark, you can probably talk about how the patterns come together on Equinox.
Yeah, so let's say you've got the Equinox, you've got the arc of all those black squares. That's actually the range of targets. So the ones on the bottom left of that arc are the ferrous, and they come up as negative numbers. And then you've got all the remaining positive IDs stretched around that arc. And basically, at least for Minelab on Equinox and Vanquish, if the boxes are black, that means that you're going to hear signals from those kind of targets. So you can imagine if we've got it in what's called all metal, where all the boxes are black, then you can hear everything in the ground as you're sweeping the coil over the ground. Now what you can start to do is actually decide as the user, I don't want to find coke, which is at say 0 and 1 IDs. You can actually remove those boxes and they're not black anymore. And you might also decide I've had enough of digging pull tabs, so you also block out up around sort of 12 to 15, for example, get rid of those. And so you can start to actually build up your own what's called discrimination pattern, which is personal to you, that lets you choose what you want to ignore in a session. Because depending on the area you're in, maybe you're in a field near a village and lots of people like to go drinking in the field, then there's going to be lots of pull tabs in that field, so you want to ignore those, for example. And there are ones on the internet, on forums, people actually suggest what the best discrimination pattern is. If you're hunting, I don't know, gold staters in a particular part of England, then there might be a particular discrimination pattern that's best to use. And a lot of people, once they become familiar with the product, actually prefer to not use much of a discrimination pattern. They like to hear all of the information coming into the air and use more of their brain to decide what they're going to dig or not dig. So on Minelab products, historically we've always had an all metal button, which is just a quick way for people to toggle between having the discrimination pattern running, so choosing what to block out, or hearing everything. And that's just part of a tool that people like, particularly with Minelab products. I guess an extension of that is the more black boxes you have present, the more interesting noises you're going to get coming through, and you can actually, some people like to hear the ferrous, the negative numbers coming through, and the reason they like that is because quite often in a real situation in a field there's lots of fragments of rusty junk everywhere, and then you've got your coins or your rings or your whatever you want to find nestled amongst all of that junk. And so you constantly, like if you listen to a detector with all of the black squares present, which we call all metal, if you listen to that, it's just so much information going on. And most of it, in many cases, 90% of it is ferrous. And on a Minelab product, that means it's making sort of a low grunting noise, so it's going all the time. And one thing you can do on the sort of mid to high range products is actually tailor how loud that ferrous sound is. You can also choose where that ferrous information starts being negative or positive. You can choose that subtle boundary, because in some places, I don't know, maybe you're on a Roman villa site and there's been a lot of rust leaching into the ground from thousands of years ago, and you just want to hear a little bit more ferrous and call that a good target because there are coins nestled in amongst that Roman villa remains.
So you can actually make the audio quite informational, so that instead of just not hearing the targets, you can actually hear them in a different way. So you can hear, as Mark said, the iron grunt. You can make that a relatively low volume, so it's not intrusive, but it still gives you information. And if you're an audio detectorist, it really allows you to get maximum information without slowing down.
If you're on a messy site, you don't have to use you don't have to create a discrimination pattern. You can use your 50 tones, which also works like setting up a discrimination pattern.
But in an audio sense?
In an audio, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can do the discrimination in your brain.
With your brain, yeah. And that usually works a lot better than actually blanking things out. If you blank something out, your detector's got to go quiet and then make a noise again when you get a signal next to it. So if you've got a lot of targets next to each other, if you're going quiet and then getting a signal next to it, by the time you've swung you could have missed it.
Yeah.
The fun thing about discrimination is like I do it on the beach if I'm just looking for pound coins or something like that. It's just set up so you accept that and then you just walk along.
Yeah, so if you've got as we said with the ID tones last time, when you start learning what type of targets return what type of IDs, and if you've got a plan.
That again comes because on the beach all modern losses are shallow. You're not going for depth, so you can 90% say that your pound coins are going to come in 24, 25.
So let's say you were looking for a lost ring for somebody. You know exactly what you're looking for. There's no point.
No, because gold can come in from your very, very low numbers. Again, it depends if it's laid flat that way, so you just got the very, very thin edge.
Yeah, I suppose the shape
of gold, or it's a big fat one laid on its edge that way. You can use it in your favour, and it can also work against you.
So I think the main thing to take away is that the detector is still always seeing everything. Everything is always there. It's just your preference on whether you want to hear everything as a symphony altogether, or you want to kind of direct.
So I was just going to say, your technique of finding the gold wedding ring that's lost, I mean, that would, maybe for a first quick pass, you could just say it's going to be between 12 and 20 on an equinox and do a quick rapid, and maybe you find it in the first 5 minutes because you've actually ignored everything. And then if you don't find it, that's when you have to look at a lot more IDs and open it right up and try a bit harder. And that's when you ring up Paul and get him to come out and do it for you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? You either want to, if you're somewhere where you know you're going to be finding anything, like a medieval field, you're on a settlement site or something like that, where you're going to be finding small hammered coins.
Yeah.
So you don't want to be notching out that, thinking, well, foil comes in there. All them things that you could be missing.
Don't go too crazy with discrimination unless very specific.
It depends on where you're at too with your detecting. If you're newer, then you don't want to be disturbed by all of that information that you can't do anything with. Whereas if you're a more experienced user where you get all of that information, For example, if you start finding a lot of nails, then that's telling you that there's been something built at that site and it's worth looking at. Whereas if you've got those hidden so that you don't see them, then you'll never know they were there. You won't know that that site's important. So it just depends on where you are in your journey.
Yeah, and I think the 50 tones is great if you're an expert and can handle that much information. Like you've mentioned, a symphony. It's more like a cacophony. So for anybody that's just getting into it, they just would really struggle with that, and they just need something simpler like 2 or 5 tones, just so they know that, okay, if it's a silver coin or something, that's what we call a high conductor, it's a nice high pitch, and everything else is a lower pitch.
On the Equinox you can move your tone breaks.
So Equinox, you get to choose where things sound high pitch and where they're low pitch and how loud each one is, and you can configure it.
Because the Vanquish is on discrimination segments, isn't it? But you get more depending on which machine in the range you have, don't you?
The Vanquish range it's tailored to be very approachable and easy to use for people getting into metal detecting. So a lot of that decision making around all those things we just mentioned for the last 5 minutes, we've sort of made presets on that product to try and make it just easier for people to pick it up and go.
Yeah, that's what I'm using at the minute. I'm using the 540 and it's great. I think 25 discrimination segments on that is quite a lot.
Yeah, and as you step up through the range, you get more control as well. So the Equinox 800 will have more audio adaptability than, say, the Equinox 600, and more again than the Equinox range.
Phil, you mentioned one thing then, which I've something else that I've heard of a few times, but I don't really understand what it is. And you mentioned coke in the ground. What is classed as that? I don't actually. Yeah, I don't really know what's classed as coke.
Yeah, so coke will generally have very low IDs. It's a very poor conductor of electricity, and so it'll have the IDs of 0 or 1. So inevitably, and it's a nice size as well. It's generally fairly uniform in size. It's not as though you're going to get sort of very flat or very thin cross sections. So you're generally going to get very consistent IDs.
But what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think coke is burnt material in a really low oxygen environment. I think that's the difference between between charcoal and coke. Coke's been burnt in a very low oxygen environment.
Barbecues on the beach are a nightmare.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It gets broken down and you end up with thousands of tiny little pieces.
If in Australia, if we have a bushfire, then there'll be a lot of charcoal left around from that bushfire, from the burning trees, and that becomes conductive and is a similar issue.
So in lots of parts in the UK, you've just got coke in certain fields where obviously they did blacksmithing or something a long time ago or had a fire, and it's just distributed around the field, and a lot of other products can't handle coke very well, so the detectorist is stuck with having to dig up coke.
Which sounds good.
Yeah, but I suppose that could be a sign of habitation. So it's kind of a bad thing.
Absolutely.
And a good thing.
Well, it's telling you what something's gone on there.
Yeah, and that's why you want a detector that can discriminate, that says that's coke, I know that's a cut quarter Roman coin sitting next to it. So obviously in the real world, as I mentioned earlier, you've got what you want. Let's say it's your hammered coin, but it's in amongst coke, it's in amongst rusty remnants of a Roman villa from a couple thousand years ago, and it's all densely together because it was an area where people lived. So over recent years, it's become more and more apparent that detectorists want to hunt in the areas where there's been habitation. And so what that means is you need a detector that can see more as you're sweeping across. It really needs to be able to see in the gaps. And so we call that target separation. And that's the sort of dimension we measure products on, is how well they manage to see between the gaps, between the junk.
Essentially, how close two targets can come together before you can actually isolate the fact that there's two targets.
So if you look on the internet, or if you go to Detectable, these kind of festivals where people have detectors and they're shooting videos and doing tests, then quite often you'll see like a test where they have a piece of wood with a coin and nail, and they're quite close together, and they run the detector over it, and you can hear the and you're actually hearing the individual coins sitting between the nails. And now there's a limit to that at some point where everything's so close together that it just sounds like all nails and you don't hear the coins anymore. So that's why people do that test, because it's one way of sort of getting a feel for how good the target separation is of a product.
It's an interesting point, actually, in that metal detection is very indistinct. Radar, for example, is very high frequency, and so it can pinpoint small targets close together. But as soon as you start getting to metal detection, the frequency is very low, so you can't spatially separate targets. And so that's why targets actually start to merge together when they start to get closer, because the detector can't actually identify, or the detector can't identify that there are two targets. It sees a magnetic signature that's a combination of those two targets, and that's why you start to lose the identity of the two targets when they get closer together.
Yeah, very technical term, they get smushed together.
So with that target separation, is that something that's adjustable by the detectorist, or or is that you always want the best target separation you can?
It's a very good question. So it depends on the product. Equinox, for example, has a recovery speed setting, so you can actually dial it in. And there's actually a decision that the user has to make, which is if you have the recovery speed set to the maximum, which is like very fast, then yes, you will see all the little targets in all the gaps. But just the way that the physics of the metal detector works is you actually lose a bit of depth when you do that. So you're not going to be able to hit the bronze axe head that's at 2 foot anymore as easily. It's probably going to lose a little bit of depth. So you've actually got to make a trade-off there. And it also depends on how fast you swing, because obviously if you swing slower, you're going to see more times in the gaps. So there's a bit of a trade-off, and you actually have to, again, play around with it a bit to get a feel for what you prefer and what's going to work at the particular site that you're at. Are you going for shallow? Are you going for deep? Have you actually got the whole day on your permission that you can actually go nice and slow and take your time, or do you need to be a bit more ruthless and move quickly across the field, sort of wildly swinging, looking for those easy targets?
That's interesting about bringing in swing speed a little bit, because like you said, if your swing was, if it took you a minute to do a swing as an exaggeration, then the timing that you'd have in between those two targets would be so much more, wouldn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately there's no easy answer. It's always becomes a compromise, and you're sort of trying to optimize. As you try and optimize for one effect, you'll start to sort of de-optimize for something else. So it's a matter of sort of really working out what you're trying to target so that you can optimize at best for that.
Once you learn your detector and you realise, right, if I do that, that's going to happen. Your coil choice as well. So you could opt for a smaller coil and have a lower recovery speed. With a larger coil, we'll get onto that in another one, but a larger coil is going to mask more.
It goes back to that question you asked a couple of videos ago, where you had like the big coil, and yes, it's got the big field, but it's a bit like having a big net. It actually sees more of the targets all together, so they all get smushed together. It's that technical term again. And so you can't tell one from the other anymore. But with a tiny coil, you're now fitting in the gaps beautifully, and your field isn't touching the rusty nails each side of your hammered coin.
Accuracy, yeah, that's good. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thanks again to Mark and Phil and Paul. And if you'd like to join us again, next time we'll be talking about ground balance. So really exciting stuff. Thank you.